Hey people, just Siobhan here, quickly jumping in at the start of the show to remind you that we have a new sponsor, and that is the Animal Publics book series, which is part of the University of Sydney Press. So the wise people at the University of Sydney have decided to have an animal studies focused series. It's called Animal Publics. It has fantastic series editors in Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and Melissa Boyd. It is the hot place to publish your animal studies work, and also a good place to go and look if you want to stock up on animal studies publications for your institution. So check out Animal Publics, part of the University of Sydney Press. This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. At the time I'm recording this episode, it's just about an hour before the 2019 ASA AGM, which I'm going to attend. And I'm absolutely confident that we're going to vote another fantastic executive in place to represent ASA and to represent you. These people are volunteers who work very hard to promote animal studies scholarship in Australia, in New Zealand and around the world. So if you're not a member of ASA, you should think about joining. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. It's your association and membership is very, very reasonably priced. Well, once again, this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from the city of Christchurch in New Zealand, where I'm attending the ASA 2019 biannual conference, which is called Decolonising Animals. And once again, I'm really lucky to be joined by someone who normally I don't get to really speak to and hang out with, so it's a real great honour. This week I'm joined by Natasha Fijn. Now, Natasha is a scholar based in Canberra at the ANU, and today we're going to discuss her book, Living with Herds, Human-Animal Coexistence in Mongolia, and it was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. Welcome to the podcast, Natasha.
Thanks. It was actually published in 2011, but came out in paperback in 2017.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So it's a new edition. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so that also means that hopefully it's much more reasonably priced.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But as we always say on Knowing Animals, if you can buy the book, wonderful. If you can't, ask your library to buy it. And if it's paperback, you can get a copy for your institution's library, but also your local library. So think about ordering a copy, and that way everyone can learn the good news about the lives of animals and peahupans in Mongolia. Okay, Natasha, can you tell us why you wrote this book?
So I started out researching within ethology and animal behaviour, but I became very interested in animal domestication and not just the origins of domestication, which is generally what bioanthropologists or archaeologists focus on, but current processes that are ongoing. And so my previous research prior to this book project, which was my PhD actually, was on animal cognition, problem solving and intelligence. But I wanted to focus on social engagement between humans and other animals and how animals become integrated culturally within a hybrid community.
Wonderful. Now, there's plenty to ask you about. I really want to hear all about domestication, but I think probably the place to start is in Mongolia. Can you tell us where Mongolia is and the kind of country it is, the kind of humans that live there?
Well, there's a sort of Mongolian cultural area where there are an ethnic group in Russia to the north, and then there's Mongolia itself, and then in the south and Inner Mongolia. But my focus was in Mongolia itself, but in the Hungai Mountains. So it's a mountainous region where there's trees on the mountainsides and river valleys. So it's not the broad, expansive grassland steppe, but more that sort of taiga landscape that you could envisage in Siberia or, Yeah,
and what kind of lives do people tend to live in that part of Mongolia?
So they're very adoptive of new technologies like solar panels and mobile phones, but the way they live with animals is pretty similar to the way they've lived nomadically for thousands of years. Like there's evidence that 3000 BC there were some practices that are still evident today. And so I was interested in the fact that they still rely on herd animals for their survival, like as a means of sustenance, and that it's a different way of being with animals. So I find I have issues with the industrial kind of factory farming complex of our Western case scenario, and so I want to highlight how there are different ways of being with animals in the world and different philosophies and attitudes towards animals. So in Mongolia, there is a close connection with other than human beings, including the mountains, lone trees, the rivers, but also the domestic animals that they live with. Yeah.
So if I was, say, a woman living in Mongolia, what would my relationship be like with animals, say, in the part you studied? Would I perhaps have a herd of hard-hooved animals that I'm moving around with, or what would that look like?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I went there thinking, I'm really interested in the horse, because I grew up riding horses, and I knew that Mongolia is the land of the horse, where, Genghis Khan expanded out with, so historically the horse has been very significant. But then when I turned up in the field, I realised that horses were more a male domain, and there were multiple species in a herding encampment, which included sheep and goats as one herd, and cattle, including yak, in the higher altitude areas. And in the desert and some places in the grassland steppe, there's camels, but they weren't in my field area. So once I got into the field, I thought, I can't just look at horses. I have to look at what people are doing in their everyday lives. And so with the women, I would help with the milking. Although I wasn't actually good at the actual milking, I would be like one of the kids where you take the calves to the cows and then remove them again. So it's kind of still people are hand milking in Mongolia, and it's not that industrialised, mechanised style of milking. And so you're very aware of, but that's also part of that domestication process with the taming of the young animals. So milking was very significant for having a tame herd, because the young animals are part of that milking process, and it links the mother, bonds the mother and the young with the herding family, because that nurturing bond is very close, and so they associate that nurtured bond with the family of herders as well. So the herders are with the animals individually from birth until death. So that some of the first individuals these domestic animals are seeing are humans, and so humans become an important part of their extended social realm. Yeah.
So you've used the word domestic and domestication quite a few times, and it's obviously a very big theme in the book. Can you tell listeners what that concept means to you, and perhaps something about the ways in which you've problematized it or thought it through in new ways?
That's a good question, actually, because that was central to what I was sort of trying to think through. And you can either reduce domestication to a term that's very sort of Eurocentric, which would be our kind of artificial kind of selection and breeding, or you could expand it out and say, but then there's the sort of free roaming reindeer herds in Siberia, or free roaming herds in Mongolia. Do you call that domestication or not? And within that book, I decided to call it, instead of, because I wasn't looking at the sort of long-term archaeological process, but contemporary, everyday kind of domestication, I was thinking of it as a sort of social sphere, and basically the hotel or encampment is like the domestic sphere, or domus, or home. And so I was calling that a co-domestic sphere. So it's a collaborative engagement between human and other animals. So it's a multi-species sort of hybrid community, is how I'd refer it. Like Dominique Listel was talking about the combination of ethology and ethnography, and he was saying, we need to think of these as sort of multi-species hybrid communities. And so I think that's how I think of the domestic sphere of the herding encampment. It's a co-domestic sphere.
And is it a nice space for the non-humans, do they want to be there?
Well, the thing is that they don't have the fences we do. So the fences are really to keep predators like wolves or people trying to steal the animals out rather than keeping the animals in. And so they only have sort of a corral to put the sheep and goats in the night to protect them from wolves, because wolves are an actual predator that's in the environment still there. And so the management is not locking animals in a captive kind of environment. So the traditional kind of classic definition of domestication involves captivity and control of a population, and Mongolian herders don't view it like that, because they're not holding the animals captive. They're encouraging them to remain in this co-domestic sphere. And it's like all animals have the concept of home or a home range, and in this context, herders and the herd animals all think of that hotel or the encampment as home, even though it moves in the landscape. So they move up and down the valley, but the herders and herd animals all still relate. And so when they're moving, the horses, they're not guided to a new location. They just know where they want to go to that new pasture, and then the herders go there too. And so it's sort of a co-communication as well. It's not just the herders dictating every move or what's happening. It's also the land in terms of how the pasture is, and the herds that are dictating what happens in people's lives as well.
Fascinating. Well, it certainly sounds very different to the, I guess, dominant forms of human-non-human relations that we have in the West, in countries such as Australia, New Zealand, etc. But I'm also, I guess, just wondering, many of the animals will have their life ended, though, prematurely. Is that right, for food?
Well, it's interesting because they consider it like killing a lamb sort of a bit abominable, because that sheep hasn't had a chance to reproduce. So they wouldn't eat lamb or baby goat or baby calf.
Right.
You wouldn't eat veal.
Yes.
You allow that animal the chance to live at least a few years to live their life. And so the males are castrated. Most of them are castrated because they only want one as the breeding male. So there is some degree of manipulation, but the manipulation of the herders, like compared to that Western case or the Australia, New Zealand, or Europe or America, it's to a much lesser degree. Yeah.
So When you look at the situation in Mongolia and the relationships between the human and non-human animals, what are the big lessons for you in terms of what this tells us about the relationship that either could exist between animals and humans or does exist?
Yeah, well, when I look at, say, the farming scenarios in Australia, in New South Wales or here in New Zealand, I think that community-based local food would be more similar to the Mongolian way of life. The factory farming scenario is like another world, but and it's just a completely different philosophy. Instead of that kind of scenarios treating the animal like a mechanized being that's for economic purposes, and in Mongolia the animal's not thought of in just economic terms, and very rarely money is exchanged. It's usually one animal's exchanged for others, so it's a sort of different process of exchange, but the herd animals are viewed as extensions of the family and as part of the prestige of the family. If there's a large number of animals, then you've got but then it's not a huge herd. Like the sheep and goats, there'd be 150 to 200 animals maximum, so every individual is known in detail, and their behaviour and their so with the sheep and goats, the coloration is quite noticeable as well. So say with the ears, like they'll have speckles on them or kind of markings on the back, and so unlike the sort of homogeneic kind of white sheep, you would have a lot more coloration, so you can actually identify the individuals easily.
Interesting. Well, I'm sure a lot of people listening are very envious of your opportunity to do this research, and perhaps they're thinking how wonderful it would be to go and do some immersive ethnographic work and learn about different ways in which humans and animals relate to each other. Can you say a few words about what it was like actually going and living in Mongolia, and, how was it hard to be accepted in the community and gather your data and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it was hard going because there's not the amenities that you would have, not the running water. We had to go and get the water at the time, with an ox cart, and I mean now people have vehicles more, but so the amenities was difficult, and speaking the language, and so I can speak Mongolian, but if I want to speak about things philosophically or about my emotions, I find that more difficult, and so those elements are hard, and so I think people think, oh, it could be idyllic, but actually it's in practice quite hard going. But I can remember because I think one of your questions is what was influential, like an influential animal book, and for me it's those early picture books, or like Black Beauty or Watership Down, where it was from the perspective of the animal, and another one was Heidi.
I remember Heidi.
And Heidi because she goes up in the mountains and she's herding the sheep and goats with extended family, like with her grandfather. And I was in the field in Mongolia, and I thought, hang on, maybe I'm in my version of Heidi. Because I was riding the horse and had the sheep and goats, and there was like native flowers around, and it was very remote, and I was thinking maybe that was my kind of dream. And then I was thinking, yeah, but I didn't realise how hard it was, because when you go back to the encampment, there's always chores to be done, and it's a hard existence, but a good quality of life. I felt like herding is a fulfilling quality of life, because there's not just one task you're doing, it's all different kinds of activities, and just for me, engaging with animals every day in terms of the milking and the young animals in spring, like the little foals and little yak calves, that one-to-one contact with the animals was amazing, because you get to know them as individuals and behaviourally what their characteristics are, and the herders will say, well, that one's crazy, or that one's a very quiet Nomhon one, so it just means that it's sort of very tame and placid.
And did some of the animals like you? Did you find that some took a shine to you and others didn't hold you in such high regard?
Well, at first, because they know the herding family really well, and the herding family said to me, you have to tie your hair back because they don't like people with hair waving all around the place, and you wear a dell, which is like the traditional Mongolian outfit for the milking, so they have working dell, so that you have the smell of the cows on you. And so at first, particularly the yaks were very wary of me because I had unfamiliar smells, and but after time, then they get to know me as an individual, and then they're fine. And because I'm not very afraid of animals, and so I'm sort of happy to have contact with them physically, like give them a pat or whatever. They sort of soon adopted me into the family too. It's sort of like being adopted by the herding family. You have to be adopted by the animals as well.
How long were you there for?
So I went for a year in 2005. Some of that in the winter, I was in Ulaanbaatar learning Mongolian and setting up the project. But then I lived in the countryside for months. And then I went back in the spring of 2007, and that was for the field work for that book. But more recently, I've been back, and because I do filmmaking as part of my research. So in 2017, I went back on a Werner Gren fellowship in the spring and autumn, and filmed. So
wow.
I had a bit of a break where I did research up in Arnhem Land in Aboriginal Australia, but then it was like 10 or 12 years later, and I went back to the same valleys, and it was pretty amazing going back. And then some of the herders, like one of the boys, he was 11 previously, and then he was 21 and married himself and had his own little baby.
Sweet.
So it was quite interesting, the changes, but then the actual way of life was still similar to previously. But I did note that people have more vehicles now, and so I am a bit concerned that some of the connection with the horses or the oxen will become lost, because I think the communication between the horses and the oxen is very interesting and important part of that herding way of life. And so, because a lot of the ox carts that would have been used, they were used from 2000, 3000 BC, the same kind of design. They are now sitting on the grassland steppe and maybe utilised for drying dairy products, but they're not actually using the oxen to move encampments anymore very much, only in the very high mountains now. And so I felt, you can't like halt culture and progress, but I felt a bit sad about that for so many thousands of years that technology had been used with the oxen, and then so they don't have those oxen anymore. Doksum Jav, one of the matriarchs of one of the encampments, she said to me, that ox you knew, it was called Ulana, or red ox, and it was this lovely big male ox. That was the last oxen they had. So I was there seeing the last of that. Yeah.
Although perhaps maybe not bad for the ox though. I mean, when I think about the advent of the car in cities, it was a blessing for horses in the Western world as well. Although of course it brings all other problems with it as well, such as need for petrol and very complicated. Let's get to our 5 quick questions. Now, are you ready for the 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Okay, now you've already started to answer this one. Perhaps you've got something else to add. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, so I think for me, those narrative fictional accounts as a child was very significant, because Watership Down is from the perspective of the rabbits in a community, and Black Beauty, you get the perspective of the horse. And so I think that's a continuation of my research. I want to get into the perspectives of others, and including other cultures and other animals, and try and think how might they be engaging, and how are they thinking about that culturally. And because I think animals have culture too, so yeah.
Wonderful. So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, because I do filmmaking as part of my research during my PhD, I wanted to sort of talk about my methodology that I used in the field, and because animal studies was quite not very prominent in 2000, and I think it's 2006 or something, and so I wanted to, because I had been doing natural history filmmaking or wildlife filmmaking earlier, but I'd gone away from that to an observational ethnographic approach to filmmaking, and I wanted to say how you can combine observational or ethnographic filmmaking with human-animal studies, and so with thinking about ethological or animal behaviour research and ethnography. And so it's sort of trying to combine different approaches to this hybrid community of humans and other animals, because a lot of the sort of natural history films are focusing just on animals, or like the ethnographic films are just other cultures, but I was trying to combine the two. So I was using some sort of stylistic techniques from my natural history filmmaking background, but I wanted to use the ethical approach of observational filmmaking, because you have to bring respect to other cultures, and because it was a human-based kind of, there was better ethics than I had observed in the wildlife filmmaking kind of genre.
So that was your first piece. It was a film. What was it called?
Oh no, it was a text-based piece, but had some video segments as illustrative. So often with my research, I try and have text, but a lot of visual images and video segments in it. So because I've sort of got two tangents, the animal studies side of things, but also visual anthropology. And I think the two can be combined quite well, because because animals are often not particularly verbal, you can convey the kind of kinesthetic movement and body language of the humans and the other animals quite well through audio visual means. And so I think I like the idea of communicating ideas and concepts beyond just text. So whether it's through film or through like a podcast like this,
Indeed.
or an exhibition space, I think it's important to push the boundaries just beyond the book or the academic paper.
Absolutely, I agree. Well, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, when I was starting my PhD, I read Donna Haraway's, so it's like a slim volume, The Companion Species Manifesto, and it dogs, people, and significant otherness, and that came out in 2003 before her When Species Meet. And I really like that because it was about domestication, so she went into the typical tropes of the origins of domestication and that sort of bioanthropology, zoology perspective, but then she also went into actually touching animals and them as companion species, and so I really liked that approach, and I was thinking, yes, that is what I'm trying to do in Mongolia. So that slim volume was made a big impact on me, and even though it's not animals per se, Anna Tsing's work on mushrooms coming out of the same place, University of California, Berkeley, with Donna Haraway. I think both of their work has been very influential on my own work. Yeah.
Wow, wonderful. Well, what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Well, for me, it's knowing animals in different ways. Thinking, how can we view their perspective and their world? So it's a similar approach that you would take to other cultures. Like, how do you try and understand them culturally and socially? So breaking down the barrier between human and animal, it is hard to sort of think cross-culturally, and people can think very differently, and then trying to think across the species divide is sort of even harder. But I like that if I'm thinking from a Mongolian herder's perspective, their perspective may be closer to figuring out what animals actually think and how they are socially. I like how in the Mongolian herding scenario they utilise the herd animals' natural behaviours. So say with the horses, they have a stallion and 25 mares about, and depending on how well off they are, and then the foals. And so it's the same structure as you would find, the Tak that live in Mongolia, that wild type scenario. It's that same structure. So they're not trying to fight against what the animal's natural instincts are. So I think it's quite a hard scenario for horses, and it's amazing how adaptable they are, that they can survive isolated in a stable context inside. I mean, it's remarkable that they don't go crazy.
Well, maybe they do. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think factory farming, definitely, the industrial kind of complex. I think there really needs to be a move away from that scenario, because it's torturing the animals and not very nice emotionally for them, or it's treating them as machines. And so, I mean, there are farmers that are pushing towards, regenerative practices and holistic practices, but often that's in relation to biodiversity. And I think there should be more an emphasis not only on biodiversity and conservation, but also the welfare of the animals. And I don't think that the two are an either or. You can have biodiversity and think of the sentience of the animal and their emotional lives. And maybe that people should be looking more towards other nomadic cultures that move their animals frequently and have smaller flocks and know the individuals well. Like, really, in going to Mongolia and then writing the book, and then making the films, I want people to see that there's other ways of being with animals that are outside this factory farming scenario.
Well, what are you working on next?
So I was saying how originally I wanted to look at the horse. I'm sort of moving back to that project now, and looking at the horse archaeologically, genetically, and across Eurasia, but in the context of the Mongol horse and sort of a Mongolia-centric approach instead of a Eurocentric approach. I think too often the domestic animals and domestication is viewed very Eurocentrically and from that Western case scenario. So say, look, here's another kind of way of being with animals in the world and way of being with horses that people may have not considered previously.
Wonderful. Well, where can people find out more about your work?
So I've got on the ANU research page, because I'm based at the Australian National University and I'm part of the Mongolia Institute, so there. But also, if people want to have a look at my filmmaking, I've got a web page. It's Fijn Films, so Fijn Films, and often that's linked to clips up on Vimeo, so you can put in Fijn in Vimeo, and then there's a lot of my footage on there, and that includes some footage relating to Aboriginal Australia too, and connections with totemic animals.
Wonderful. Wow. Well, it sounds like must-see viewing. I'll certainly be checking them out. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, you can also find us on the internet at Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.